Meet Layla. She stands at the window of the 14th floor, eyes fixed on the sidewalk below. This is where it happened. Weeks have passed, but the memory hasn't faded. She can still hear the sirens. She can still feel the air being sucked out of the room when the news spread. An accountant on her team died by suicide. Layla is the VP of HR. She's supposed to be fixing people's problems. People come to her and ask for help. But in this case, no one did. And she keeps replaying every interaction she had with him, asking if there was something she missed. Was there a sign? Could she have done more? She wipes her eyes and looks away from the window. Her inbox is full. Policy updates, benefits questions, an email from the CEO asking her for next steps on how to improve employee morale. She's supposed to have answers, but she doesn't. There's a wellness webinar that she's been asked to put together, an awareness campaign that someone on her team proposed, but nothing feels like enough. Posters and lunch and learns won't erase what happened. The grief in the break room is still heavy. The silence in team meetings is louder than ever. She leaves her office, and in the hallway, people are whispering. As she gets closer, the conversations stop. Are they blaming her? On most days, she blames herself. Layla wants to help. She wants to create a culture where people feel safe to talk about mental health, where vulnerability isn't hidden behind spreadsheets and deadlines, where no one feels that alone ever again. But right now, she feels completely lost. Today, I'm speaking with AnneMoss Rogers, a suicide prevention expert, author, and mental health educator who turned her own tragedy into a mission to save lives. After losing her son, Charles, to suicide, she became one of the most sought-after voices on building connection, resilience, and emotional well-being in schools, corporations, and communities. And I'm looking forward to hearing how she would help someone like Layla, someone who is suffering the weight of loss, who doesn't know what to do next, but is longing to create a workplace where no one suffers in silence. My name is Jay Abbasi, and welcome to Unstuck. Real people, real stories, real solutions. While the details are changed to protect anonymity, what you just heard is based on a true story of challenges that come up in the real world. And we discuss how to navigate these environments with practical tips to help you get unstuck and build a more fulfilling, impactful, and balanced life and career. So AnneMoss, we're going to dive into Layla's story here in a little bit. I really want to learn more about your story though, because I know that you've gone through a lot in your life. You've experienced some tragedy, and I've heard you talk about how that was what caused a lot of change in you and your own journey. And I was hoping that you'd be open to share a little bit about that experience.
Absolutely. So around 2010, we noticed that my son was struggling, and he started using drugs and alcohol. And over the years, we would try a number of things. And unfortunately, in 2015, my son took his own life. He killed himself. And he was the funniest, most popular kid in school. So all that was a huge shock. And he had become addicted to heroin, which I didn't know until 30 days before he died. We had gotten a diagnosis for major depression at some point. We had used a lot of outside resources and counselors and professional help. And I'll be honest with you, I just felt defeated. And I felt like the worst parent in the world. And I also felt responsible. Like there were signs, there must, at first I didn't see the signs, but later on I would. And I beat myself up for years for not, for not stopping it. But we tend to think we can put on a cape and be a superhero when really the person we have control over is ourselves, and we can't really control the actions of another.
Yeah.
But it was the grieving period was very difficult. And I will say, in that period, I developed a lot of really good, healthy coping strategies because there's nothing you can do about the pain, but I wanted to lessen my suffering.
Mm.
Because you can lessen your suffering if you use the right strategies, or you can make it last a really long time and suffer for a really long time. And that is not what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I can only, it's hard to imagine what that must have been like. I lost my father many years ago. It was in 2014 when he passed away, and it was very unexpected. He had a heart attack, and that was hard. But I see my daughter now, and I don't, I just, I feel for you. My heart goes out to you of what that was like. And for what you then went through, what was, I guess you said you found some coping mechanisms and ways in which you reduced the suffering. What do you feel helped you to be able to reduce some of that suffering?
One was writing and talking about it. I wrote a newspaper article. Took me 6 months to write 1,200 words. And I noticed when I wrote that article that with each edit and each day I worked on it within that 6 months, I was processing that loss. I was processing all those difficult emotions of anger, bitterness, relief, sadness again, anger, all over again, back and forth. And really, once I finished it, and I wasn't going to turn it in until it had a message of hope. And I kept wondering, why can't I finish it? And that's because I hadn't reached a place where I could find a message of hope. And I couldn't put it in an article until I discovered a way to convey that to my audience. So I realized how much writing was helping me. So I started a blog called Emotionally Naked, and it just made the biggest difference for me to be able to process that grief. And because the newspaper article went viral, all of a sudden I had this audience and they were following me because they were going through the same thing. And so there was this community built that I had not intended to build. It's just out of my pain. And all of a sudden it felt like this shared experience, which took the burden off of me, where I didn't feel so isolated and alone and it was all me. I felt like other people, they put comments, they were sharing their hurt and their pain, and they were validating some of the difficult feelings I was having as well.
Mm.
So that's probably my main one. But I built a whole toolbox: running, making sure I felt my feelings, that being absolutely critical, not avoiding your feelings. Because when you avoid your feelings, they're going to come back like a boomerang on steroids, and they're going to leak out in ugly and unexpected ways, like anger and irritability. And a lot of times people think being strong is all about looking strong and never crying, but it's really being vulnerable, because it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable, especially in public, and especially for men, because our culture doesn't allow that. So what happens when people feel a certain difficult feeling, they go straight to distraction. And they skip that part in the middle about sitting with that feeling and feeling that feeling. So those really hard, difficult, intense emotions last about 60 to 90 seconds. Yes, it took me to my knees. It took me curled up in a ball, kicking the wall, screaming, crying, you name it. But at the end, it would lift. I would feel a sense of relief. That's when you engage in a healthy coping strategy, writing, running, whatever it is for you. When we skip that part of feeling our feelings, we're robbing ourselves of healing, and we're increasing the length of time we will be suffering. So that pain has a purpose, and that is emotional building blocks to healing.
Yeah, I often refer to this as the strategies that we use to respond to disruptive emotions. And the first three are ineffective, and they are to fight with them, right? Try to push them down, right?
Yeah.
Fuel them, which is keep thinking about it and add gasoline to the fire. Or what you were just describing there, flee from them, run away, distract yourselves. That was always my go-to strategy. That's the one I relied on. And still to this day, I have to be mindful of, because it is the default whenever I'm experiencing some pain. But I always share with people, and it's nice to hear it from your perspective. The most valuable strategy of all is to feel the emotion, to feel the pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, that is the healing part. That's where you learn and grow and start to become a new person, an extraordinary person. So you're denying that becoming of an extraordinary person. You're also, that's the link you have with the one you love too.
Yeah.
And, as I was going through it, I would repeat to myself, you can do this. You're so sad and you're crying so much because you loved so much, because you gave so much. So, I wanted to be able to soothe myself as well. And all of that builds resilience. And, after a while, you may react initially to any kind of tragedy with that same, oh my gosh, response. But your recovery time is shortened because now you have strategies and a toolbox of things you can use. It's just really important not to default to beer or I'm going to have a glass of wine. I remember meeting with a man who said, I can't get through every day. So for the last 7 years, I've done a lot of drinking. And he says, I think I'm an alcoholic now, but at least I can get through the day. At 7 years out, he was exactly where I was at 3 months out. And I thought, holy Toledo, that man, this is going to be awful. And then I went and met with my friend Roz. And we talked about our son. She had lost a son 7 years prior as well. And then she started talking about vacation. And I'm like, Roz, wait a second. You're talking about normal stuff. And she goes, well, it's been 7 years. And she said, I started the nonprofit. I figured a way to give back. And that's helped me move forward. And I thought, I want to be like Roz. So I found people that could sort of be my template, that I could say, all right, I don't want to do that. So I came and I cleared all the alcohol out of my house. And then I do want that. And I tried the nonprofit route as an executive director, and I didn't like it. But I thought, I need to find my thing. But in order to do that, I got to try some things on. I've got to try this, and then it'll become clear where that path forward is as I do things. If I sit back and just wait for it to fall in my lap, it'll never happen.
And I know that you had a digital marketing firm at one point. Is that
I did.
right? And then now you're one of the most sought after mental health speakers out there. I guess.
Who'd have thought?
Yeah. So what are some of the things when you have gone into, let's say, organizations, or you see in conferences, or you're talking with people, what are the things that people are getting wrong about mental health? What are the things that are the common things people are either misunderstanding or they're just not really getting about mental health challenges?
I think the first thing is as it pertains to themselves, trying to fix it instead of manage it. Now, there are some things that over time you can get past. Like if you're a perfectionist, you're probably never going to completely be over that, but you can recognize when you're falling into that pit and go, okay, this is going to make me anxious. It's going to lead to this, and that's not a good thing. But recognizing the signs and having strategies to work through those moments. So I think that's one thing. And then I get a lot of whispering. So a lot of people don't want to ask their question out loud. They want to stand in line and wait for me. And then they want to go put me in a utility closet to ask their question. And sometimes I just want to say, do you realize that everybody standing back there has every bit as devastating an issue? It doesn't mean you're a terrible parent. It just means you have a different issue. But a lot of people are going to have similarities to that.
Yeah.
So those are two things
Yeah.
are pretty common.
Yeah. And it seems from what you just shared, people are really hesitant to share something so openly in front of others in regards to their challenge. How do we fix that? How do we make it where it's okay to talk about? What is it going to take for us to get past this hurdle and be able to make it where this is a common thing? It's an okay, it's real, and we need to start talking about it more.
So what I've noticed is the more people tell their stories in a safe and effective way, because there is a way to tell your story in a good way, the more other people will start talking about it. So let's say I go and do a talk in the construction industry. Well, they're the number one profession for suicide. And they have been doing intense work in that area and talking about it a lot. So I see that they're further along and more open in having that discussion. Whereas if I hear from like a bank, they're much more standoffish, and I have to really make the talk just a little less emotional. And I need to just put their big toe in. I don't need to throw them in the boiling water. So I need to understand my audience and
Yep.
where they are emotionally on the topic. And maybe I go into a rural area where they've had a lot of suicides and they want to know how to manage the grief, and they're so desperate for guidance, so that they're like hanging on every word. But so it just depends on who's in front of me. I have to make those considerations every single time, recognizing what the issues are in their community, and customizing the talk to focus on that. And businesses, you may have a lot of really young people who are struggling with their own personal issues, or you get a business that has mostly older people and parents, and they're worried about their children. But usually it's kind of a mixed audience. So I have to make sure I have something for both sides,
Mm-hmm.
but not so much for one or the other that I lose their interest. So, I've figured it out over the years. What I do is at the end of my talk, I ask people to fill out an index card of one thing they learned. And they can put how it pertains to their personal situation. It's all anonymous. And for them to leave that for me on the center of the table. And I also tell them that they're giving me a gift, that I will reach for those cards later in the day when I start to feel that crash after telling my story, because I'm usually going on, pretty into my story.
Sure.
And that has emotional results later. Well, when I start to feel that crash, I grab those cards and I start reading them, and they fill me back up and they remind me why I do what I do. So I'm really honest with them and I tell them why, but as soon as I tell them why, their heads are bent down and they're filling out their card,
Yeah. That's
which is
beautiful
so
that you do
nice.
that. That's so nice that you do that. I think there's a connection that you immediately establish with your audience by asking them to do that and giving them the why behind it. And I'm sure that they're appreciating your vulnerability. And I think that
They
that's
do.
something, that's a lesson to be learned for anyone in a leadership position. And I think that, for example, in the story with Layla, like she's really struggling because she feels responsible and she feels like she's going through it for herself and feeling that guilt. So when you consider how leaders can lead these mental health initiatives within their organizations, what do you feel is important for them to learn how to go about this in the most effective way?
They need to start with a story. They have got to have an addiction or mental health story in their family. It doesn't have to be, let's say you have a CEO who's in recovery from alcohol addiction. He might not want to go into that,
Hmm.
but he may have had an aunt who died by suicide.
Yeah.
And, he may want to tell that story instead. Or, early on when he was 17, he was in a bout of depression. We need to start with a vulnerability story, just a piece, not your entire life, to tell everybody that it's okay. It's
Yeah.
okay to have that story and that part of your life, because nobody's life goes flawless the whole time.
Right.
Nobody's is perfect. You always hit a speed bump,
Yeah,
and
I just want to jump in
we
because like the thought that goes through my head, and I can imagine an audience member thinking this, which is to say, well, but I don't have that kind of story. I don't have that, and I would challenge them immediately,
oh yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Because
you do.
everyone has the story. They just may not think it's as impactful as a story, such as, what you went through or what other people are going through that struggle with addiction or they have really bad anxiety. But all of us ourselves can definitely point to times in our life where we had mental health struggles, or as you said, we had loved ones who had mental health struggles.
Right. Exactly. I mean, somebody's best friend died in a car crash, and there was a CEO who reacted by trying to shut down his grief. And he talks about how he mishandled that, how he started smoking pot, and he started, driving real fast and drinking and drugging too much. So, he started having outlandish behavior before he kind of figured out, something is really up. And he actually did seek out help. He looked for a men's grief group and he joined it. And he was pretty young when he joined it. And I thought, man, that's impressive. But he is showing it's okay to ask for help. But let's say he never did ask for help. He could say, I really wish I looked for a grief group early on. That would have helped a lot. So you're saying it's okay to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of courage. And we want that message of asking for help being a message of courage, and being vulnerable is being courageous and not weak. And when I wrote that newspaper article, I thought, this makes me look so weak. And everybody said, you look so, you're so strong. And I just didn't get it forever.
Yeah.
And it's still, when it comes to me, that's hard for me to accept.
Well, what you did was you said what other people have thought or even are thinking, and then you gave them the permission to feel what it is that they were feeling.
Right. And it kind of validated what other people were already feeling.
Exactly. And now, I know you obviously you're working with leaders all the time who have the challenge of taking on that responsibility of the mental health within their teams. And in Layla's case, for what happened where someone committed suicide within her company, so she's feeling that sense of responsibility. How would you help someone like that? How would you work with somebody who's telling you, like, I feel like it's my fault. I should have noticed the signals. I should have done something differently. And now she's being asked to fix everything and she feels so lost.
Right. So I gotta jump in and say people die by suicide, they kill themselves or they suicided. They don't commit suicide. It used to be a crime, and that's where that phrase comes from. And it's been in our lexicon for hundreds of years. So I am not word shaming you at all. But we need to try to not say committed, because it's not a crime, but a public health issue.
Mm,
And you're talking about the coulda, woulda, shouldas
yeah.
when it comes to suicide loss. And I'm going to tell you 100% of the people that come to my grief suicide loss group struggle with the coulda, woulda, shouldas. It is part of the process. Anytime you have a suicide, because it can be preventable, it is not always preventable. People feel guilty. I missed a sign. Why didn't I know? Why didn't I put out the right kind of stuff? Well, you just can't prevent every suicide. All you can do is the best you can do. And you can use that as an opportunity to make systematic changes to go upstream to prevent people from getting crisis, recognize the signs. Because unfortunately, after you have an incident like Layla did in this story, people are going to come to your grief seminar, your suicide, recognizing suicide seminar. They may not have come before, but they'll come now.
Right.
So use that as your launching point to put your grief into action. But also understand that if you're a leader and you've been through this and you feel that sense of responsibility, you have just experienced a trauma. You are having all of the typical symptoms a trauma survivor would have. And I worked with an organization whom they actually watched somebody jump, and they were in a high rise, and all these employees were just, they all felt like a mess because they had witnessed it. And
Yeah.
a lot of them knew the guy, and it was really terrible. But we need to normalize the fact that those emotions are typical, they're natural, and they won't last forever, but acknowledge them, sit with them, allow them in. You will be able to work through this, and you will grow, and you will find opportunities. Most of the teachers or leaders that I talk to, when they have been through that kind of crisis, they completely flip the script. They change how they do things. They see things in a different way, and they become a person they never thought they would be. And that is a better person.
Yeah.
So this can be a launching point to a really a better future for, of mental health.
Yeah. So there's a sense of a radical acceptance of whatever it is that you're going through, whatever's coming up. And
DBT scale.
yeah. And I can feel two schools of thought that could be the response of, let's say, CEO or someone who's leading a team, which is, okay, let's accept it and let's acknowledge how we feel, and then let's move on.
Move on.
Right. And then there's another group that would say, no, we need to actually talk about this. right? I can imagine the first leader saying something, well, we don't want to keep staying in the past. We want to be able to move on. And then the second group saying, no, we need to take inventory and really allow our people to talk through what's happening. What are your thoughts on these two different schools here?
So the first one you said is the most typical. It is typical in a workplace, it's typical in a school. Let's put our foot on the accelerator. I want to get back to normal, but we must acknowledge that grieving process. Because we can't just glaze over it, because if we glaze over it, what are we doing? We're doing that avoidance thing.
Yeah.
And so it's going to last longer, create bitterness. The company doesn't care, all that, kind of rhetoric that we'd like to avoid. We need to process it. What ways, can we now have outside resources? And maybe there's some grief nonprofits in the area, and maybe they could bring in sort of a group and have a discussion on what are the natural feelings that go with grief. What about the coulda, woulda, shouldas? What are some exercises I can do, understanding that it is going to stick around for a little bit. You may go back to that and have those self-blame moments, but eventually you will move forward and stop blaming yourself. So sometimes I still do. And I'm like, AnneMoss, you've already forgiven yourself for that. You don't need to rehash all that all over again. Nothing new has happened. Because once you've done it over and over and over, you realize, I beat this to death. There's just nothing more. I can't look at it from any other angle.
Well,
So that,
it's also because you have addressed it.
right.
You did go through it, right? It isn't as though you've been glazing over it for years. No, you did the
Right.
work within yourself. And I'm curious as to how it could go in one of those group conversations where, I mean, have you had this experience where it actually got a little too emotional, where it went a little too far? In other words, like, do you have to set some of those boundaries to ensure that it doesn't get a little too, too sensitive, where people are maybe sharing too much, or it's going down the wrong path? Has anything like that ever happened? Or do you feel, no, whenever you give people that space, it always has a very positive effect?
I've facilitated for so long that occasionally I remember the first time I had a group and somebody kind of went on and on and on and on with their story.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I learned is when they start talking and you feel like, okay, it's going on a little, I set the ground rules at the beginning, share the air. And that usually takes care of it. But every once in a while, there's that person who's really hurting, who hasn't heard that. And they're kind of on repeat with their story. It's a good idea to kind of pick out something they're saying and go, Tom, a minute ago, you were talking about the anger, and I need to stop you in your story and see how the rest of the group, because you bring up a really good point. I want to see what the rest of the group feels about that anger. If somebody else shares that emotion you've been talking about. So you're basically saying, you said something so important. I want to propose it to the whole group, but you've also been able to stop them from going on another 20 minutes.
While acknowledging them, you honor the
Right.
person. You acknowledge, and I think this is so valuable. I mean, that's a wonderful way to facilitate this, and it's a skill I know you've developed just through
Yeah,
experience, right? But
exactly.
but I imagine how valuable that is for people in leadership roles who are trying their best to be able to work through things like grief and mental health, and being able to facilitate even just a meeting, right? Where you have a meeting about something. So you
Right.
said something, you set the ground rules, you kind of make an intention. What does that sound like? How do you set those ground rules in a way that gives people the sense it's a safe space, but we're also not going to go on and on and on and let this be this overly emotional dump where one person is speaking for too long? What does that sound like?
So share the air. what you say here stays here. I am not a professional counselor. I am just facilitating a conversation. So you're not going to give advice to one another. You're rather going to say what's helped you, because what you say might help someone else. So those are a few, and I think there are a few more, but not to get too graphic, because usually in a work situation, they haven't witnessed the body or the scene. But in my case, oftentimes people have found the body, and
Mm,
it's been very traumatic and upsetting and scary. And I mean, you can't unsee that.
right.
I am okay with them talking to me one on one to sort of get it off their chest. But when you say it to the whole group, it can activate other people's trauma. So we got to be careful about the graphic nature, because what we need to understand is that someone's suicide can activate those already at risk. So you're at work and somebody dies by suicide. There is somebody, if you've got like 200 employees, there is somebody who's been thinking about doing that for a long time. And they're like, Sam's done it. Maybe I should do that too. So we need to acknowledge the fact that other people might be struggling, and equip people with the skills to be able to, tell if somebody else is struggling. What are those red flags? But we got to be really careful in that grief space not to overwhelm people
Yeah.
with that,
Yeah.
because it can really start to fuel the guilt, but give only the most basic, kind of outline that the most basic steps you would take, because it can be so hard, but really focus on the healing and the grief. And I usually like to say that don't deny the other person the privilege of supporting you.
Yeah. There's a theme I'm hearing in our conversation, I think is a beautiful one, which is when you frame all of this as a way where the person feels as though their expression of it, their sharing is so they help other people.
Exactly. And I'm going to tell you that with men especially, that's how you get them to, don't call it a support group, call it a discussion group. And if somebody is resistant, you call it a discussion group and say, your contribution could help other people. And
That's
that
so powerful.
often,
Yeah.
people like to help other people. And that's what a support group does.
Well,
That's exactly what it does.
and it's also even your story, right? And also you felt like the way in which you healed was by helping other people.
Right.
So you experienced it, and now you're inviting other people to go through
Yes.
that experience as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's beautiful. It's so powerful. I hope everyone listening really takes home that lesson, which is when we want to influence someone to engage, give them the little bit of a nudge that they could be helping another person. And I speak with people all day, every day, oftentimes people who feel stuck. And it's really quite beautiful that when I ask them ultimately what it is that they want, what is it that they really want to do, what is the legacy they want to leave, nearly every time, and most people say to me, I want to help others. I want to make a difference in other people's lives. It's something that's deeply wired in all of us. And so I always want to, as we get to the end of our conversation, I always want to invite you to imagine that you get to meet the person in this story. So in this case, it's Layla. So let's say Layla has you come in to do a talk on mental health and suicide prevention, and she's very inspired by what you shared, and she's on that line afterwards of people who want to
Yeah.
speak with you. She brings you into that utility closet and she tells you her story of what she's going through. And knowing you from this conversation, of course, you would listen, you would acknowledge what she's feeling, and you may present a question to her. You may ask her something to get her to start thinking about it a bit differently. What would you ask her?
Okay, I thought you were going to ask what would I ask at the beginning, which is at first, tell me more about how you're feeling and how it is being a leader in this situation. So I would want to hear where she was emotionally first.
Yeah.
And then, usually you ask the question, well, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you felt guilty and that you thought it was all your fault. And I want you to let you know that's part of the process. And do you think that one day, or you could set your intention now to forgive yourself one day? Just say, sometime in the future, will I forgive myself, and can I set that intention? You don't have to put a date on it, but if you set that intention, you're more likely to get to a place where you just forgive yourself and you accept what happened.
Yeah, I love that. I love that easing into helping someone to heal in a way that's doable, because asking them, can you forgive yourself right now? That could be a hard thing. But if I'm on the receiving end of that and you're asking me, do I see myself forgiving myself in the future? I could say yes. And now you've just given me enough shift that I needed to go down
Yeah.
that path. I love it. I love it. And Moss, this was such a wonderful conversation. I highly encourage, by the way, anyone who's looking for more resources. I know you do a lot of writing. There's also a lot of posting you do on LinkedIn. The website where people can find you, it's mentalhealthawarenesseducation.com. It's in our show notes. And it's also a place where we'll put your social media handles as well. LinkedIn is, like you said, that's where you post
Yeah,
a lot of
that's a
content.
big, I would love for everybody to connect on LinkedIn, because your comments help me learn. And I read everybody's comments. I read more comments than I do posting.
Yeah, I'm with you. That feedback is so valuable. And so I really appreciate you taking the time, Moss, to speak with me today. This was such a wonderful conversation, and I hope we get to do it again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you bringing up this conversation.
What I really appreciated about this conversation with Anne Moss was how she was able to take something that's really uncomfortable to talk about and really normalize it. And I hope that you're taking home the idea that this isn't only about suicide prevention. It's about mental health in general. And mental health issues are not only in reference to certain people who are going through really depressive seasons of their life. I believe everyone has mental health challenges, literally everyone. It's just at different degrees. So all of us can get value in learning how to work through it ourselves and how to help others to work through it. So as we do with every episode, I will share with you what I believe to be 3 of the most valuable insights and 3 actionable takeaways. The first insight: running from your feelings will never heal you. She said, if you avoid your feelings, it's like a boomerang on steroids that's about to come back and hit you. So that was an interesting way of putting it. But if we feel our feelings, we shorten the recovery time. Second insight: vulnerability is strength. She told that story about how when she first shared what she went through with her son, how she was afraid that it was something that people would perceive as a weakness of hers, that she was showing weakness. But the feedback she got was about how strong she was to share that story. And I know you've heard this. This is not new. But I think that this is one of those things where people intellectually understand but don't apply. And I really encourage you to apply this, to realize that every time you feel a pull, an attraction to be vulnerable, and you hold yourself back, you are actually being weak in that moment. And you would be strong by expressing that vulnerability. That takes courage. Third insight: giving back helps us to move forward. That example of when she shared her story with others, how it helped her to heal. So I invite you to do that for yourself when you're working through a challenge. to share that, to give and help others in a way, and also invite them to help others. So I think that was such a powerful takeaway for me, which is when I want other people to heal, rather than saying, do this for you, invite them to do it because it contributes towards other people healing. In other words, tap into that desire that we all have to help others. And if you do that, it will then motivate them more to want to share and talk through what's going on. Actionable takeaways. First of 3, number 1, acknowledge the grieving process. Acknowledge it. Don't run from it. Accept it. Allow it to come, and then don't try and push it away just to get to the next thing. We use that example of, a CEO who says, oh, we just want to move forward, or the one who says, no, let's really talk about this. We want to go with the latter. We want to go with a process where we really allow ourselves to fully accept whatever is coming up. Second, actionable takeaway. Share your story. If you want other people to be vulnerable and you want to work through a challenge that a group all is dealing with, as the leader, you start by sharing your story, whether it's a personal mental health issue or something that is very close to your heart, a family member, a friend. By sharing it, you invite everyone else to share their stories. And then the third actionable takeaway is, if you're struggling with forgiving yourself, set the intention for self-forgiveness. Set the intention. Can you set that intention to forgive yourself in the future? And that's a great way to start to work through any feelings of guilt or responsibility. Join us on Friday. I'm going to approach things a bit differently on Friday. So what we often talk about is how to get ourselves unstuck, how to work through our own challenges. And what I think this episode brought to light was how valuable it is for us to know how to help others get unstuck. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go behind the curtain a little bit with you, and I'm going to walk you through my model of coaching and how I help people to have those aha moments and create those shifts in perspective so that it helps them to get unstuck. So I'm going to kind of give you the tools that I use so that you are equipped to help others to work through their challenges. So until next time, thank you so much for listening.